Why can you remember the lyrics to a 90s song, but not what you had for lunch yesterday? Why do some moments stick like glue and others vanish in seconds? Well, in this episode, we're unlocking the mysteries of memory, how it works, why it fails, and what you can do to make it work even better. So, we'll explore the stages of memory from quick snapshots of short term memory to the active processing and working memory to the rich archives of long term memory and how context can make or break what we retain. So, whether you're studying for an exam, designating learning experiences, or just curious about how your brain holds on to life's moments, this episode will give you the insights to remember more and forget less. Let's unlock the science behind how you remember, starting now. Once again, here with Craig and Shannon to discuss how we learn, and in this case, memory. Uh, Welcome to both of you. And shall we just dive right in and start talking about that amazing short-term memory?
Let's do it. Yeah.
My favorite thing about when I think of short-term memory is remember when you had to remember phone numbers
Right. Yes.
before they were programmed in your phone.
Mhm.
I still remember my phone number as a kid because it's just stuck in there. And that's part of Miller's law, the seven. You can remember seven things plus or minus two. So it's kind of interesting. Have you all? What's your thoughts about that? About Miller's law and remembering seven and good old fashioned phone numbers from time to time, I
So,
guess.
yeah, for me, George, I can still remember some of those phone numbers too from earlier years. And just because of the repetition too, I think the repetition of the number and calling the number, we
Right.
don't do that today with smartphones. You don't have to dial. And so it was the repetition of dialing over and over and over and over again. And finally, it gets into your long-term memory. But one of the things I struggle with, so for Miller's law, Miller says that, seven's kind of the magic number about things that we can keep in our short-term memory, minus or plus two. So for me, it might be five, right? And so the example that I could share is my wife oftentimes has a list of things, tasks that, that I'm responsible for. And so sometimes I'll start on that task. For example, I've got an electrician who's coming. I've got a pool guy that I've got to talk to. I've got the car that needs the oil change. I've got yard work I need to do in the front yard. I've got yard work in the back. Once I get to five or six things, I'm kind of locked in. And then my wife's like, "Hey, Craig, what about the next thing?" And I'm like, I'm calling people, I'm doing stuff, but I can't really go past that number of five. Now,
That's where it stops.
That's where
it stops for me. What Miller would say is he would say where I've made a mistake and where I could learn more is by this concept of chunking. So when I think about my house, the yard stuff and my house stuff could go under the house category, right? And then there could be an automobile category. And if I categorize them, right, then I can have, let's say, 7 categories and a ton more tasks. And I can probably get my head around it to be able to be more effective and more efficient in getting more accomplished. And for my wife, her love language is service. So when I do things, when I get things done, she feels like, okay, she feels really good about our relationship. So that's just an example. If I chunk things out and put them in categories, that can help me so I don't feel so overwhelmed because now the categories are bigger and I've got things listed under the category. So that's just one example I wanted to share with you today.
I love that too, about thinking about chunking things together. And another simple example of just chunking and numbers in particular, because someone can give you a stream of numbers. We know we can memorize a phone number because we've learned how to do that. But if I give you 9 numbers and just say, recall these, we might not be able to do all 9. We could, because 9 is 2 plus of the 7. But if we chunk them like a social security number.
Yes.
I mean, we know how to recall our social security number, but it's chunked. There's 3 and there's 2 and there's 4. And so we chunk those together and it's a pattern. We've learned how to memorize in that pattern, that chunking. And so most people can just ring off their social security number like that because we've learned to chunk it in that way. But if I put all those numbers just in a stream of just a line here, it's going to be harder to recall that than if I chunk them together. And this just also aligns with how our just in our think of Vygotsky's social cultural dynamics too, because in our society, we've learned how to memorize our social security number like that. So, it kind of, we see different influences there with the chunking of the numbers, but also how, we know we have to have our social security number memorized, and that has to do with our societal and cultural influences as well.
And if anybody wants to know more about Vygotsky, go check out episode 1, where I believe we covered Vygotsky.
I've got a recent example. I took my son to lunch, and we're at Wahoo's, and I go to use the restroom. Yeah, Wahoo's is this fish taco place.
Okay.
And I can't get into the restroom because there's a combination lock. So I go up to the person working at the front, and they show me the numbers, and it's 74649. And so I say it over. I walk back to the restroom. I start plugging in. I got 746, and then I lost it. I'm like, I wasn't able to retain it. So now I really feel a little bit embarrassed. I got to go up to the person again and say, can you share that with me one more time? But the next time I did chunk it, 74649. And by chunking it into 2 different numbers, I was able to retain it long enough to be able to use the restroom. So just another example.
Yeah, that's another great example of chunking.
That kind of brings us to the point that meaning and distinctiveness within our short-term and working memory are important because you made them distinctive by, okay, here's what was it, 2 and 3? You broke them up into 2 and 3, so you made them distinct, and you had to go, so it was meaningful, I would imagine. But that's super important, right? Because we can retain things when we believe they matter more than we do, because we see so much, and we see so much just during the day, and we're always processing with all of our senses all the time that some of it just isn't meaningful. We don't want to retain it, right? So how have you seen meaning and making things distinct kind of work for us for our short-term or our working memory?
Just kind of to piggyback on that as well, you talked about distinctiveness, and what we found from research as well is that when there is something distinct versus something that's similar, when there's a series of words or experiences that are similar versus an experience or an item that we're trying to recall and memorize that is distinctive, we are going to be prone to recall and remember the distinctive event, situation, number, item, as opposed to those that are similar. Our brain is able to recall the distinctiveness as opposed to just a series of words or situations that are very similar. So in terms of working memory, working memory / short-term memory, they are similar and meaning the same thing, right? So we're thinking seconds as opposed to long-term memory when we're thinking years here. But like you said, distinctiveness. So emotion and what matters to us, putting that meaning can also make it more distinctive than a series of other things as well.
Can we use that to jump into long-term memory then?
Yeah, absolutely. I love thinking about long-term memory because it's fascinating, right? It is fascinating to think about what we can recall from our own personal history, what was going on in the world, that type of thing from years ago. So there are 2 things that we know really make an impact when it comes to memory in the long term. So think of attention. Okay, so attention, the amount of time and attention we put onto something to recall it, retelling that in our brain, that type of thing, retelling it to others, but also emotion as well. So those 2 factors really do, and other things as well, but those 2 factors, attention and emotion, really make an impact on what we're going to recall for long-term memory. So I have an example for you guys. Can I share it with you?
Please do.
Okay. So I was thinking of our podcast today, and I was trying to recall things from many years ago. We're not going to say how many years ago, but from many years ago, I was trying to think, what can I recall with pretty vivid detail? And I was thinking back to my sophomore year of high school, and I had prom my sophomore year of high school. And I can remember distinctive details of that day, from what I wore, from my shoes to my earrings. I know the car I traveled in. I know the food I ate. I know the interactions I had. So that happened several years ago. I cannot tell you at all whatsoever what I wore the day before prom, what I ate the day before prom, or the day after prom. I can't tell you any of those details of any of the days surrounding that. But the date of prom, I can tell you everything that whole evening long. And that, again, was a long time ago. But think of attention. Remember those two things I told you,
Wow.
attention and emotion. Okay.
Okay.
So I put lots of work planning into prom. And, high school students might think of prom from when they are a freshman on. You learn about this when you're in junior high and elementary school. You see other students, siblings, and friends who go through this. So the retelling of stories of prom, the attention we put into the details, just like you'll remember everything from your wedding day because of the amount of attention put into it, and also the emotion. Okay. So long-term memories that have significant emotion, whether it's wonderful, beautiful emotion or really challenging, difficult emotions. Like if you're sad, you're happy,
Right.
distinctive emotions, you're going to remember that because of, think of the hormones in your brain, from cortisol to adrenaline, and how the brain is impacted in the amygdala and the hippocampus from those chemicals. And with the emotion, it prompts those chemicals in the brain. So think back to your own history and those things you can remember from a long time ago. Is there strong emotion attached to it? And did you take a lot of time and attention thinking about that, planning for it, retelling that? And you're going to see a lot of connection between those two things, attention and emotion, to long-term memories.
That's a great example. And I especially like the part about attention because, well, there's a common phrase, pay attention. We're paying attention. So it takes effort because you pay attention by putting specific effort forward, right? Because I imagine it was probably a big deal to go and figure out what prom dress you were getting and what restaurant you were going to prior to going to the prom. So it took that specific effort that all accumulated into this one event, the prom, which is cool. It's a big event for a lot of us. So that's super interesting how that all comes together with attention.
Yeah.
So when we talk about long-term memory, there's a model by Tolving that he developed in 1972, which is kind of fascinating to look at. He talks about the distinction between episodic, semantic, and procedural memory. And so the first one, procedural memory, it's part of this implicit long-term memory, and it's knowing how to do things. So your motor skills, so driving would be an example, or riding a bike. There's a phrase that, with riding a bike, you can always just get back on it, right? And you intuitively, you're going to remember from that procedural memory. And then semantic memory is kind of fascinating. This is part of your explicit long-term memory, responsible for storing information about the world. So oftentimes it's about the meaning of words and general knowledge. And so this is something, knowing that, right? Something is the case. So for example, we know that Paris is the capital of France, right? Those kinds of things that we store. And then episodic memory, this is the third one, which is pretty interesting. This is part of our long-term memory, responsible for memorization about events or experiences in our lives. And this is the one that's the most powerful for me. Oftentimes it's those experiences where I oftentimes make a mistake, and I tend to be pretty self-critical, and I've got this negative bias where I'm going to remember the negative much more than I'm going to remember the positive, right? I could get 20 positive statements and 1 or 2 negative, and I've got this negativity bias because I want to really focus on the negative and improving. But anyway, in that model, this episodic memory with those early experiences, oftentimes those are kind of deep grained inside of us. And sometimes those are even almost more at an unconscious level too, which is pretty fascinating. As we study in psychology, there's things that we're consciously aware of, but there's also things that happen in our lives that we haven't had a time to really work through. So Gestalt therapy, we call that grist for the mill. So we've got things that we haven't really worked through. And sometimes those can come out later in life, and they can impact how we see things kind of through our subjective lenses, right? I'm wearing glasses, but my glasses, I'm not seeing things objectively. None of us are objective. Our perception's always different based on our experiences. So I think episodic memory is probably the one that I oftentimes in my own life, I'll remember the stories, but I don't remember the details. Kind of like, as Shannon shared, that the details of what had happened, I don't always remember all the details around the event, but I remember what happened in my emotional response to that.
Mm-hmm. You talked about bias, and I think it leads me to thinking about confirmation bias too. So when you think of confirmation bias, we have our own memories attached to different experiences, kind of like Greg is talking about here too. And because we have these memories, and keeping in mind that our memories do not always equate to reality or truth, right? But that's our memories, right? So some of our memories aren't actually true. But confirmation bias is whenever I receive new information and I compare it to what is already in my memory, and confirmation bias is like, oh, well, I don't really want to give this new information much objectivity, much effort in trying to actually identify if it's true or not because of what my confirmation bias is. My memory already tells me this based on my experiences and my life events, and these are my memories. And so confirmation bias is, okay, based on my memories, I think this to be the fact and the truth. And we discount other information because of our confirmation bias. Does that make sense?
Yes.
We see that playing out a lot everywhere.
Yeah.
A lot. That's a yes. I love that. I love that example. Yeah. So as we're wrapping up, how about we talk about and give some practical memory strategies? Like I have a couple that I think students should know, but maybe that's my own bias, right? People should know. But Dr. Bjork came up with the term desirable difficulty. And that's one thing that I always try to remember, because if something is very simple, we don't learn it it doesn't stick. Right. It needs to be, now it can't be too difficult where we just give up and quit. So it has to be in that realm of desirable difficulty. And that's a little bit different for each of us. So my thought for our students is, if something seems difficult to learn, good.
Yeah.
Because that means that effort that we talked about before, and that attention and intentionality and even a little bit of emotion, because it's hard, helps it stick.
Yes. Yeah.
That is so cool. And then the other one that I love is because I like sports too. So deliberate practice. So when you're studying, be very, okay, this is what I'm going to learn. This is how I'm going to do. I'm going to quiz myself, whatever it may be. Quizzing yourself is a great way to learn. And it helps us recall our memory back as we need, because as everybody knows, we take it in and then we have to recall that memory in order for it to be any good to us. And that's what memory is, the recall piece. So quizzes are great for that. So deliberate practice, have a specific goal, and give yourself feedback along the way, or use artificial intelligence to give you quizzes and feedback along the way as well, so it sticks. And make sure that if learning feels too difficult, if you hear anybody say the phrase, this is simple, then you know what? They're not learning. They're not challenging themselves enough to learn. So those are my puts for students. What are your favorite
I think
strategies?
For me, a retrieval practice, the testing effect is a big one for me. So I remember being in middle school, and I was struggling in history because I had to memorize all these facts. And so I wrote them down on note cards, and I looked over my note cards, but I still wasn't able to retain it. Then the practical application of that, rather than kind of passively rereading it myself, if I gave that to my mom or dad and I asked them to pose the question and have me explain it, then it started sinking into my longer term memory, and I was able to kind of get my arms around it. So I think retrieval practice, the testing effect, is really critical if you're studying by yourself and you're looking through note cards, just to have another person come alongside of you and kind of engage in that. I found that I was really able to remember a lot better. We talked about chunking before, just about breaking things into categories, and that oftentimes really helps us. Spaced repetition is another one. So essentially, this is when what we do is we look at material at longer intervals. And so we might review a concept a day after learning it, and then a week later. And so part of getting it from our short-term to long-term memory is this repetition piece. And I think the more that I can continue to circle back to that. So an example would be if I'm working on a presentation, if I just do it all in one day, I'm not going to really remember it as well. If I start the presentation day one, and then I say day two, I'm going to add a little bit more to it. Day three, if I continually go back to that, it gets in my long-term memory. And then when I'm presenting on it, oftentimes I feel a lot less anxiety and I really remember it. But if I ever do anything last minute, so an example is, as a kid, I always studied for tests a lot of times the night before. The night before I can cram, and oftentimes I can do okay on that test. But if you ask me anything the day after that, I don't remember any of it because I wasn't doing it consistently. I didn't have spaced repetition between my learning. So that's another one.
That's a good one. And I think Ebbinghaus is the one that came up with spaced repetition, right? I believe it, because I know Erickson did deliberate practice, and I believe it was Ebbinghaus that came up with that concept of spaced repetition. What I love about that one is there is no perfect formula for it, but if you go to where you almost have it forgot, so you have to struggle, so spaced repetition and that desirable difficulty kind of work together. So you have to struggle a little bit to recall that content, then it's going to stick better then too. That's cool.
And the one last one I'll leave you with is mnemonic devices. So if there's 7 things that I'm looking at, if I break it up into a word, right? And I've got a word, let's say the word is following. And so I have to remember all these different things. If I put into a word and then on each letter, I start with what it is, that is really helpful for me to memorize information, is finding a way. So kind of looking at saying, okay, well, what is it that if I've got all these concepts, but if I have to memorize 6 or 7 things, if I can come up with a word for it, and then each of the letters ties into the concept. And so that's a starting point. And then if I can use that other strategy where I use spaced repetition. So now I've got my word and I've broken it up, but now I'm looking at it day after day after day. Then oftentimes I'm really able to remember things. And so I've got to be intentional. If I'm going to remember something, if I need to remember it, I can't just look at it passively and think I'm going to remember it. A lot of times I think I can. So in my mind, I look at things and I think, oh yeah, I'm going to remember that. I don't know if you've had that experience before where you were sure you're going to remember something and then it came up and it's like, oh, I totally lost. I thought I was confident I'd remember that, but now I'm not able to. So
like the bathroom code.
Yes. There you go.
Right.
I thought I had that until I got to the door.
Right. You should have been repeating that to yourself and then walked away and then got it again and come back. Oh, there's so many great tools here for remembering things. There's a couple that I think are valuable too. One is attaching some prior knowledge to something new. For example, I might, whenever I'm teaching the concept of self-care to the crisis team or students or something like that, I give them an analogy to go with it. So they are like a pitcher of water, and then they have different glasses here. And we can visualize pouring the full pitcher of water into these glasses. And then it goes on with a story description of how we have to keep refilling the pitcher, like we have to refill ourselves in order to effectively care for others and do our jobs well. So using something that already has meaning in our life, like we know what a pitcher of water does. And when we pour it into glasses, we understand what that means, right?
Right.
aligning that with a different symbolic meaning of self-care as well. So we're learning, okay, the importance of self-care with a visual aid, with a story that already has meaning in our life. We already know what these things are. We're attaching meaning to it. So learning in that way as well can be really valuable. And experiences too. And this kind of pulls in everything that you guys have talked about already. For example, when our students are out in the field doing practicum, okay, they're like, how am I going to remember everything I learned in the classroom and put it into practice? But that's the thing, they are putting into practice. They do have to put attention there. There is meaning behind it. There is repetition. There is retelling even in our own mind of, okay, how am I going to apply the humanism? What unconditional positive regard? What does that look like in real life when I'm working with people? And so taking what I learned in the classroom, asking questions, quizzing ourselves on, okay, what am I going to do? How is this realistic in this setting? What am I going to do practically? But also learning from others. So that attention and continual repetition of, maybe they're learning to write progress notes and they do that multiple days at a time, and that repetition helps them to learn that professional skill. Maybe how to facilitate a group, and starting off with some rules for the group, and they have to learn, and then they just do that every single time they gather with a group. And so that repetition helps. So there's a lot of, you guys talked about so many great things, but you can apply all of those into a bigger setting when you have to learn a lot at once. How do I do this? Find the ways that work really well for you. But remember, attention, meaning, repetition, emotion, those type of things are going to help us to recall these things.
Thank you, Shannon. One other thing that came to mind for me is this concept of active learning. And so a lot of times in our curriculum, we'll ask students, apply it to a real world setting, and so the application of things to a real world setting really helps us. But I'll give you one example. Working with you, George, we have this class called speech communications, and we had students, and they were doing the discussion, and they were passively writing in the discussion about their experience doing speech communication, right? And so George said, well, why don't we use active learning? Why not have them actually do the speech and share with each other in the discussions? So rather than passively writing about what it was like to talk verbally in front of other people, have them, use that opportunity to use the video and then they get feedback from their peers. Now we've taken it from passive learning, writing about what it was like, to active learning. They're actually doing it every week throughout the 8-week discussion. They are giving a speech and they're talking with their peers and they're getting feedback. So that's just one example of taking something from passive learning where we're talking about it to actually saying, hey, let's implement it. Let's have students actually do it. And what we find is it's much more powerful with active learning than it is passive learning. Active learning really takes you to and it gives you the experience, and we all learn from experience. So that's just one example of how we can think about learning in a different way, and rather than passively talking about it, actually develop active learning types of techniques.
Yeah, because learning's an action, right? It's a verb.
Absolutely. Yeah.
To learn at least. And I'm not an English major, so I'm just going to get off that topic. What that actually is right now. Well, this was a great episode. So all about memory and how to make ours better. Learn, use it to its maximum capacity. So this was brought to you by the Los Angeles Pacific University Department of Psychology, and this is what learning feels like.